Alright, welcome to my channel. This channel is basically every Monday through Saturday I will summarize the Wall Street Journal. So basically I'll do all the work of summarizing each story so that you don't have to read it. You can still get the valuable information from each story to determine how to use it. I mean, typically, obviously, if it's political news, you would use that to determine fiscal policy, or there's also anything from the Fed, that helps you determine monetary, where we're going economically and monetary policy. And then, of course, any kind of business news will help you determine where we're going economically, or even different sectors and businesses and how the market's doing. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So basically, the first story is tensions heighten as Israel steps up airstrikes. And I'm going to go ahead and read the summary that I've written. The ongoing conflict in Gaza is escalating, with Israel intensifying its bombings, including an unusual airstrike in the West Bank. This situation is becoming increasingly dire for the civilians in Gaza, with the slow inflow of humanitarian aid attempting to alleviate the hardships they're facing. So basically, some of the key points are that regarding Israel's offensive, Israel has increased its bombings on multiple fronts, including the West Bank and southern Lebanon. Casualties in clashes. An Israeli soldier died in Gaza, and there were casualties in various airstrikes, including one on a mosque compound in the West Bank city of Jenin that Israel alleges was being used for militant planning. International interventions. Efforts are ongoing internationally to free hostages in Gaza and prevent a larger regional conflict. U.S. President Joe Biden has engaged in discussions with leaders from various nations, including Israel, the UK, and France. Humanitarian aid. Although aid is slowly making its way into Gaza, humanitarian agencies stress that it's insufficient for the needs of the over 2 million residents. Recent deliveries include food, water, and medicine, but there's a notable absence of fuel, which is critical for many operations. Potential ground operations. Israel has signaled the possibility of a ground operation in Gaza to combat Hamas, but the timeline and specifics remain unclear. The defense minister of Israel, Yoav Gallant, commented that this operation might aim to eliminate Hamas entirely. West Bank developments. Airstrikes in the West Bank have been rare since 2006, but one recent strike targeted a mosque, which Israel claims was being used by militants. The conflict has also been seen an increase in ground raids by Israeli forces in the West Bank. Border tensions. Skirmishes at the Israel-Lebanon border involving Hezbollah, a known ally of Hamas, has displaced thousands. Both Hamas and Hezbollah are designated as terrorist organizations by the U.S. Displacement with Israel. Over 200,000 Israelis have reportedly left their homes due to the conflict, with some being ordered to evacuate, while others chose to leave. Casualties. Hamas attacks have reportedly resulted in 1,400 deaths in Israel, while the Gaza Health Ministry, run by Hamas, states that 4,651 Palestinians, including 1,873 children, have died. However, these numbers have been disputed by U.S. officials and experts. The article basically underscores the escalating tension and the significant humanitarian implications of the conflict in Gaza, with both suffering, casualties, and a looming threat of a broader regional conflict. Okay, the next story is hostages complicate planning for military operations in Gaza. And I'll go ahead and get started. Overview: Israel faces a complex situation in its ongoing war with Hamas. The core dilemma revolves around the fate of over 200 hostages held by Hamas. Entering into negotiations could hamper military operations, but ignoring the hostage situation could lead to higher casualties and international pressure. Hostage situation: photos of Israelis kidnapped by Hamas during attacks on October 7th are displayed in Tel Aviv. Israel must decide whether to proceed with its ground operation in Gaza or pause to negotiate the release of these hostages. Military complications: if Israel advances with ground operation, they may face heightened civilian casualties and international scrutiny. Additionally, a full-scale invasion of Gaza could provoke Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed militant group in Lebanon, to open a second front against Israel. Hezbollah possesses a significant arsenal of rockets and drones. Potential strategy: some Israeli officials believe that instead of engaging in Gaza, Israel should focus on preemptively striking Hezbollah's missiles capabilities in the north. This would counter what many in Israel view as a greater threat. State of preparedness: Israel has mobilized approximately 360,000 military reservists in anticipation of the next phase of the war. The ground offensive will primarily target Hamas's tunnel network and bunkers. Previous encounters: the last significant ground engagement in Gaza City in 2014 resulted in 13 Israeli soldier casualties. However, Israeli commanders believe the current situation will be different, given the prior air assault on Hamas's defenses. U.S. involvement: President Biden has been in communication with those involved and has showed support for Israel. However, there's behind the scenes pressure on Israel from the U.S. to allow time for Qatar and other intermediaries to negotiate the release of hostages and ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Hamas's perspective: for Hamas, the hostages are a way to delay a possible Israeli invasion and potentially negotiate a bombing halt and the release of Palestinians. Wider regional implication: there's a concern that if Israel gets heavily involved in Gaza, Hezbollah or even Iran might exploit the situation. To counter this, the U.S. has sent 2 aircraft carriers battle groups to the eastern Mediterranean and air and missile defense batteries, signaling potential support for Israel if Hezbollah becomes aggressive. Key takeaway: Israel's situation is precarious, balancing the urgency of rescuing hostages, the threat of a two-front war, Gaza and potentially Lebanon, and the need for international diplomacy. Okay. Headline, I guess: airline safety features are often turned off. So this is on the print edition on the wallstreetjournal.com. Airlines regulators weigh more cockpit safety alerts after close calls on runways. Okay, so technology that alerts pilots of potential runway accidents is available, with audible warnings and text alerts often coming standard on new aircraft. However, these are not always activated. Regulators have been hesitant to make their use mandatory. Some airlines are unsure about the safety, benefits, and costs of such features, even as pilot groups advocate for their adoption. Despite the U.S. not experiencing major fatal passenger airline crash in 14 years, there is growing concern about runway safety due to several close calls. Factors like inexperienced pilots, fatigue, and distractions among understaffed air traffic controllers are under debate. As post-pandemic flying increases, the FAA and the industry officials are contemplating additional cockpit safety measures The FAA is also considering guidelines on cockpit technology to prevent wrong runway takeoffs or landings. Delta Airlines and Air Canada are experiencing their cockpit safety features. The National Transportation Safety Board (NTSB) previously suggested mandatory alerts for runways too short for safe landings. While Airbus has rolled out its own system, Boeing left the decision to airlines. The cost is a factor for some airlines in not activating these alerts, and training on new systems can be expensive. Honeywell, a manufacturer of such systems, stated that their system features are activated on about 20% of commercial jets. There have been instances where these systems might have prevented close calls or incidents, leading to renewed calls for their universal adoption. The NTSB has expressed frustration over the FAA's pace in implementing these safety measures. Meanwhile, the FAA has monitored other safety measures being taken, and Air Canada plans to activate Honeywell alerts on its compatible aircraft by mid-2025. Move on to the next story. The next story headline is Empty Downtowns Need a Costly Fix on WSJ.com. The same article was America's downtowns are empty, fixing them will be expensive. Here's a summary. Downtown streets in Minneapolis, which were once bustling with office workers in the 1960s, have seen a significant decrease in foot traffic and activity, leading to many empty storefronts. As remote work became more prevalent, particularly during the pandemic, many cities in the U.S. have had to grapple with half-empty office buildings and decreasing local economies. To adapt to this shift, there are proposals to transform these office districts into lively neighborhoods where individuals can live, work, raise families, enjoy entertainment, and get assaulted. I'm just kidding about that last one. Monica Bray, a convenience store clerk, notes that only a few passers-by are seen nowadays, making the area feel deserted. Cities are now exploring ways to revitalize these downtown areas without having to bulldoze them entirely. Wow. Jacob Frey, the mayor of Minneapolis, suggests that the core of downtown needs to be reimagined, whatever that means, as a space for activities beyond just work. One approach Minneapolis is considering is offering tax incentives for converting office space into apartments. Great. And potentially creating pedestrian-only zones. However, these efforts are not without challenges, such as the architectural limitations of converting office spaces into residential areas and the need to make downtown appealing for family living. The drop in foot traffic in major U.S. city centers since 2019 has been 26%, as per an analysis by the University of Toronto School of Cities. The transition to remote work poses significant economic challenges, with a recent study estimating a potential 42.5% reduction in the value of New York City office and retail properties, translating to a potential 6.2% reduction in city tax revenue. Other cities with many office buildings are expected to face similar financial impacts. Some cities are already taking steps to reinvent their downtown districts. For example, Cincinnati has converted a significant portion of its office spaces into apartments and other uses and has established a large pedestrian district along its waterfront. Still, foot traffic remains significantly below pre-pandemic levels. In Minneapolis, efforts are underway to transform certain office spaces into residential areas, but there are challenges, especially with the architectural layout of many office buildings. For instance, converting larger floor office buildings into apartments means many bedrooms won't have windows. Okay. The report concludes by noting that some cities, like New York's Meatpacking District and Minneapolis's North Loop neighborhood, have successfully transformed areas previously dominated by offices or industry into thriving mixed-use communities. Okay. Okay, on to the next story. This one This headline is FTX founder mulls risk of testifying. Sam Bankman-Fried took risk at FTX. Will he bet on his own testimony? That's the headline for the Wall Street Journal at WSJ.com. Sam Bankman-Fried contemplates testifying in his defense amid allegations of fraud at FTX. Context: FTX founder Sam Bankman-Fried, previously a celebrated figure in the crypto world, is currently on trial in New York facing charges of fraud, money laundering, and other offenses. Their main allegations: numerous witnesses, some of whom are former friends and colleagues of Bankman-Fried, have testified against him. They claim he lied to lenders and investors, falsified balance sheets, and misused billions from FTX customer funds for personal luxuries, risk ventures, and loan repayments. They also allege illegal political donations, lavish spending on celebrity endorsements, and a significant deficiency in the company's balance sheet. Key witnesses: Caroline Ellison, Bankman-Fried's ex-girlfriend and former CEO of FTX's affiliated hedge fund Alameda Research, stated he once criticized an employee for opposing bribes to Chinese officials. Former FTX Chief Technology Officer Gary Wang alleged that Bankman-Fried reassured FTX clients about the safety of their funds when he knew they were at risk. Nishad Singh, a longtime friend and former executive of FTX, expressed his betrayal, having believed in the company's mission only to discover its alleged wrongdoings. Defense dilemma: as the prosecution case is nearing its conclusion, Bankman-Fried's defense team is considering whether he should testify in his defense. While this is seen as a risky move, some lawyers suggest that testifying might be his best chance given the strong case against him. The hope is that his testimony might sway at least some jurors, potentially leading to a hung jury. Past precedents: comparisons are drawn to other high-profile cases where defendants testified. Elizabeth Holmes, founder of Theranos, was found guilty on several counts after she chose to testify, and jurors found her lacking in credibility. Conversely, in another unrelated case, Kyle Rittenhouse was acquitted after he testified in his defense. Bankman-Fried stance: publicly, Bankman-Fried has admitted to management mistakes. Boy, were they. But denies committing any crimes. The opening statements from his defense highlighted his good faith efforts during a company crisis. The defense has not yet revealed whether they'll call any witnesses, and it suggested that Bankman-Fried has limited allies left to testify on his behalf. Possible hint: a recent court filing showed his lawyers seeking access to his prescribed Adderall medication. Okay, suggesting he might need it to participate meaningfully in his defense, including the decision to testify. All right. Okay, so next story: Europe, unlike the U.S., tackles its deficit by Paul Hannan. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and Russia's invasion on Ukraine, both the U.S. and Europe engaged in substantial borrowing. Presently, while the U.S. maintains its high deficit levels, Europe is set to significantly reduce its deficits. This current European approach contrasts sharply with its response a decade ago after the global financial crisis, when high deficits almost led some Eurozone countries into default. Eurozone regulations and lessons from the past crisis have now instilled more financial discipline in European governments, a discipline currently lacking in the U.S. Recent statistics reveal the U.S. deficit surged to $1.7 trillion, or 6.3% of GDP. For the year ended September 30th, while projections from the International Monetary Fund (IMF) suggest U.S. deficits could reach 7.4% of GDP in 2024 and 2025. Conversely, the IMF anticipates the combined deficits of Eurozone governments to drop to 3.4% of GDP this year and further to 2.7% in 2024. Countries like Greece and Portugal, which faced crises 10 years ago, are projected to have much reduced budget gaps. Christian Keller, chief economist at Barclays, points out The stark divergent. Oh my God. Christian Keller, chief economist at Barclays. I apologize for that yawn. I'm not editing that out. Christian Keller, chief economist at Barclays, points out the stark divergence in financial paths, highlighting the U.S.'s lack of efforts to decrease spending or increase revenues. If these projections hold, Europe will not only not be the primary contributor to the rise in global debts, which the IMF predicts will largely be due to the US and China. Europe's stance on deficit and debts is influenced by the guidelines from the Maastricht Treaty of 1993 and painful memories of its previous debt crisis. The treaty's budget rules, which were briefly suspended during the pandemic and the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, stated that deficits should not surpass 3% of GDP. Some European countries seek modifications of these rules, advocating for more flexibility to promote investment that foster long-term growth. The UK, under new leadership after Liz Truss, has taken measures like raising taxes to manage its deficit and reduce debt. The country aims to limit its budget deficit to below 3% of GDP in the coming years. Good luck. Some nations like Italy, France are taking a more lenient approach with slower deficit reductions. This could potentially put them at odds with the European Commission's regulations. Boom. Okay, I'm just going to kind of skip around, or rather skip some stories that don't have the greatest impact. Here's hydrogen tax worth billions in play. Summary: energy companies are in disagreement over billions in subsidies related to last year's climate law, specifically concerning the production of clean hydrogen, an alternative to oil and natural gas in sectors like steelmaking and trucking. The Biden administration faces the challenge of determining which energy sources qualify for tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act. Companies like NextEra Energy, Constellation Energy, and Plug Power advocate for broad access to these subsidies, even for those that emit carbon, to promote the growth of the hydrogen industry. They have made their views known through various advertisement mediums and meetings with the Biden administration. Labor unions like the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers support them. In contrast, firms such as Air Products and Chemicals argue that subsidies should favor businesses that only use renewable energy. Environmental groups also support this stricter view. A significant point of contention lies in the definition of green hydrogen. Some companies believe projects should be labeled as green if they utilize fossil fuel grid power, but buy renewable energy credits matching their annual consumption. Otherwise, they feel many hydrogen projects won't be feasible across the U.S. constellation. A major nuclear plant operator warns that strict regulations could derail their plans for a nearly $1 billion investment in nuclear-powered hydrogen. Environmentalists and some senators express concerns that many energy producers might manipulate clean energy rules to gain credits for projects that might exacerbate pollution. The debate reflects the broader challenges faced by industries as they navigate the technicalities of clean energy subsidies, which could total up to $1 trillion over the next decade. While analysts anticipate that the government might begin with lenient rules and then transition to stricter standards, there are concerns that this approach could inadvertently boost emissions. Okay, and then there's all that stuff. Oh, okay. Here's another story. In food deserts, cities look to take over grocery stores. Seriously? Wow. Insane. Chicago looks to small Kansas towns for a municipal grocery store solution. Chicago is considering the establishment of its first municipally owned grocery store as a solution to its growing food deserts. As it does so, it's looking to small towns like Erie, Kansas for guidance. Background: in Erie, Kansas, a town of 1,000 residents, the city took over the Erie market in 2021 to combat the challenges of food access. However, competition from nearby Walmart and Dollar General outlets has led the store to lose money consistently. Despite this, city officials remain steadfast, emphasizing the vital role of grocery stores in small towns. Bigger picture, Erie is part of a trend where U.S. cities are taking control of or starting grocery stores to prevent decline. Why don't they take over everything and offer residents easier access to fresh food? Most of these initiatives are in small towns, but Chicago, with its 2.7 million residents, this is going to blow up in their face, is exploring this option seriously. Seriously? With the, is that a, they should have had a, well, I should have put a question mark there. With the city losing multiple stores in recent years due to poor profit margins and crime, Chicago is planning to use a new $20 million state fund to address food deserts, which studies indicate can impact health and economic vitality. Other examples, nearby St. Paul, Kansas, with a population of 600, has successfully operated a city-owned grocery store for 16 years. Their grocery store not only supports itself but also contributes to the community, showing that municipally run groceries can be viable. Okay, challenges in Erie. After initially performing reasonably well, Erie Market faced challenges as local enthusiasm waned with competition from larger retailers in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. The store lost $132,000 in 2022. Efforts to rejuvenate the store have been made with improved freshness, discounts on older products, and advertising specials on social media platforms. Outlook. The goal for Erie is to limit the losses and continue to make improvements. Meanwhile, customers remain hopeful about the potential of the store, seeing current issues as temporary and fixable. Chicago's venture into municipal grocery stores is being closely watched as a potential model for other cities grappling with similar challenges. That's ridiculous. But I'm one guy. Oh, as Montana goes red, Democratic Senator taps into his local roots. Jon Tester. Look at that. Never mind. So the other headline on the print edition in the WSJ.com, Montana has had it with rich outsiders. Will that help Jon Tester win re-election? Montana has witnessed a rightward political shift, making it a challenge for Democratic Senator Jon Tester to win a fourth term. The state has consistently backed Republican candidates, including Donald Trump, in recent presidential elections. However, a shared concern across political lines is the influx of affluent outsiders into Montana. Yep, that's very true. Many locals blame them for increasing prices, taking over land, and eroding the state's traditional culture. Tester is positioning his re-election campaign around his Montana roots. He is a third-generation Montanan who still farms on land his grandparents homesteaded. Contrastingly, his primary Republican opponent is a wealthy native of Minnesota. The U.S. Senate balance could hinge on Tester's race. Currently, Democrats hold a slender 51 to 49 majority. The GOP sees Montana as a potential seat to capture. While national issues dominate most Senate races, Montanans are more concerned about local matters such as land development, agriculture, energy, and Native American priorities. Montana has experienced a rapid growth due to pandemic-induced migration, even outpacing states like Florida. This has driven up house prices by over 42%, transforming towns and increasing the cost of living. The state's long Republican-leaning history has been more pronounced since Tester's last win in 2018. However, the influx of new residents who predominantly identify as Republican could shift this balance. A challenge for Democrats is that most new residents are white, a demographic that generally favors Republicans. However, the rising number of college graduates in Montana could favor the Democrats. The key to victory may lie in addressing local concerns such as housing costs and property taxes. Okay, Democrats are trying to portray Tester's opponents as outsiders, focusing on their non-Montana origins, while Republicans are seeking to link Tester with national Democrats perceived as too radical by traditional Montanan standards. Despite Tester's efforts to cater to local needs, some residents remain skeptical due to his prolonged tenure in Washington to win. Tester will have to appeal to Republicans, independents, and ensure high turnout from Democratic strongholds, especially college towns and Native American reservations. Voting regulations which could impact the election outcome are currently in play. Some restrictions have been overturned, which might aid Tester in his re-election bid. Okay, let's go on to more political news. New crop of speaker candidates emerges. In the running, Tom Emmer, Kevin Hern, Byron Donalds, Pete Sessions, Mike Johnson, Jack Bergman, Austin Scott, Dan Muser, and Gary Palmer. What about McHenry? He seems pretty smart whenever you see him on CNBC. Anyway, let me read the headline on the WSJ.com. Republican hopefuls crowd into speaker race after Jordan's exit. House Republicans are in search of a new speaker after a lack of support for Representative Jim Jordan, Republican of Ohio, following unsuccessful floor votes. 9 GOP lawmakers entered the speaker race before the Sunday deadline. Representative Tom Emmer, Republican of Minnesota, the House Majority Whip, has declared his intentions to run and has the backing of ex-Speaker Kevin McCarthy, Republican of California. Other notable candidates include Kevin Hern of Oklahoma, Byron Donalds of Florida, who has ties to former President Trump, and seasoned lawmaker Pete Sessions of Texas. The departure of McCarthy led to a halt in the House's legislative activities. Notably, discussions on extending federal funding and aid considerations for Israel and Ukraine. Candidates will present their cases at a forum on Monday, and an internal vote for a new Republican Speaker nominee could occur by Tuesday, tomorrow. After 112 Republicans stated that Jordan shouldn't be the Speaker nominee in a confidential vote, he stepped aside. During a public House floor vote, Jordan received 194 votes, but 25 members defected, causing him to miss the majority needed for the position. The Speaker race brings about challenges for the Republicans, especially since their slim majority of 221 to 212 can lead to potential dissenters. What is that margin? It's like 9? Damn. Representative Mike Flood of Nebraska introduced a unity pledge where members can commit to supporting the designated party speaker during a House floor vote. Other candidates in the fray are Representatives Mike Johnson of Louisiana, Jack Bergman of Michigan, Austin Scott of Georgia, Dan Muser of Pennsylvania, and Gary Palmer of Alabama. Some members still back the idea of broadening the role of Speaker pro tempore. I don't know how to pronounce that. My apologies. Patrick McHenry. He's my pick, even though he's kind of, he just seems responsible and fiscally knowledgeable if you hear him on CNBC. During this, I think he's on the finance committee or one of those financial committees. During this interim period, after stepping down from the race, Jordan emphasized the importance of party unity and expressed optimism that a House Republican could obtain the 217 votes required for speakership. Let's see what's... Poll finds that more in the U.S. are backing more war and more funding. How much did we give them? Anyway, I don't even know, but... Let's summary. A recent Wall Street Journal Ipsos poll indicates that while a majority of Americans are supportive of Israel amidst its conflict with Hamas, they are cautious about the U.S. becoming directly involved in the warfare. Yeah, that makes sense. Key points. A rise in support for Israel was observed compared to prior surveys regarding the long-standing conflicts with the Palestinians. 42% of the respondents believe the U.S. should side with Israel, marking the highest since 2002, while only 3% feel the U.S. should side with the Palestinians. Why don't we just stay out of it altogether? That's just my opinion. What are your opinions? Write them in the comments below. Younger Americans, however, if you've stuck around this long, younger Americans, however, appear to be more divided in their opinions compared to the older generations. Despite the support for Israel, 52% of Americans believe the U.S. shouldn't back either party in the conflict, while just over half feel the U.S. has a duty to support Israel against Hamas. Why? A mere 38% would endorse the deployment of U.S. troops to assist Israel if attacked by its neighbors, a decline from 53% in 2021. The poll suggests President Biden's actions, such as offering moral support to Israel or moving military assets to the region, align with American public sentiment. Biden has proposed $14 billion in aid for Israel, mainly for armaments, and announced $100 billion in humanitarian aid for Gaza and the West Bank. However, Biden's strong association with Israel might present political risks, especially if Israel initiates a ground offensive with potential civilian consequences. Crazy. We're like $32 trillion in debt right now. Let's see. The survey also reveals that Americans are generally skeptical about deepening their involvement in the Middle East, with only 28% feeling the U.S. should pursue Palestinian statehood. The reluctance toward Middle Eastern intervention may stem from past military engagements in the region, such as the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Nevertheless, 60% of Americans would support the use of U.S. troops in a peacekeeping capacity between Israel and the Palestinians if an international force emerges. Notable quote, "I think the Middle East has had enough unilateral U.S. intervention," commented Trevor Casper, suggesting support would be more acceptable as part of a multinational effort. Okay, and then steep cost looms for taking Gaza. What are those costs? Okay. Challenges of a ground operation in Gaza. Context: Israel is planning a ground operation in Gaza with the objective of neutralizing Hamas. However, historical instances suggest that achieving this comes at a significant human and infrastructural cost. Urban settings typically favor defenders. The proximity of combat often nullifies the advantages of a technologically superior force, which would affect Israel given its military edge. Comparison with Mosul. Recent history points to the U.S.-led effort in 2016 and 17 to retake Iraq's Mosul from the Islamic State as a parallel. With a population comparable to Gaza's 2.1 million, capturing Mosul was a prolonged and devastating endeavor. The conflict spanned 277 days, with estimated civilian casualties ranging between 9,000 and 11,000 based on the Associated Press investigation. A significant portion of Mosul's historic center was decimated. Time constraint. Israel might not have the luxury of time. International scrutiny and the economic impact of mobilizing over 300,000 reservists may hasten the operation. A quicker operation might necessitate the use of overwhelming force, elevating the risk to civilian and infrastructure. Michael Knights of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy highlighted the predicament, suggesting that a heightened pace could lead to greater destruction. Expert views. Michael Knights warned about the pitfalls of rushing the operation, suggesting that more time would lead to fewer casualties. Retired U.S. Army Colonel Joel Rayburn believes that the Israeli Defense Forces can attain their goals in Gaza. He posits that Hamas cannot sustainably defend Gaza due to its isolation and lack of resupply routes, likening Gaza to an island militarily. Key takeaways: if Israel proceeds with the invasion, it's likely to face significant challenges, especially if under time constraints. Historical parallels suggest that such operations can be costly in terms of civilian lives and infrastructure. Let's talk about Ukraine. What happened? What happened in the whole Ukraine situation? I actually wonder how they're doing. Kiev's slow advance poses test. WSJ headline: Kiev. Same. I guess it's the same. Stalled progress in Ukraine counteroffensive. Background: in September, Ukrainian armored units penetrated Russia's main defensive line in southeastern Ukraine, sparking hopes for a significant breakthrough. Current situation 5 months into the counteroffensive. Ukrainian forces are advancing incrementally, engaging in close quarters combat within dense networks of Russian trenches and minefields, while contending with artillery and explosive drones. An officer remarked that their progress is steady, yet it doesn't appear to be the significant breakthrough anticipated. I guess this is no longer the latest thing. Russian countermove. In a recent move, Russia launched an offensive targeting the eastern city of Avdiivka. However, the Ukrainian military reported that Russian forces made minimal territorial gains, suffering significant losses in manpower and armored vehicles. Challenges for Ukraine in the West. Ukraine must recruit and train more soldiers and maintain pressure on Russian forces to deter them from fortifying their defenses. Western allies, especially the U.S., face the challenge of bolstering financial and military support for Ukraine. These efforts could be hindered by a shifting focus towards new conflicts in the Middle East and political disagreements in the U.S. Potential diversion of support. European diplomats have expressed concerns that Western nations, given other international crises, particularly in the Middle East, might overlook the evolving situation in Ukraine. You think? There's also apprehension, maybe, who knows, maybe one perhaps if China invades Taiwan, that there might be even more diverted and more spread out, more thinned out, rather. Who knows if we're going to enter there, but we've given a lot of money and equipment and weaponry. There's also apprehension about the redirection of ammunition and resources initially meant for Ukraine. U.S. stance. President Biden emphasized the U.S.'s commitment to support both Israel and Ukraine, and eventually Taiwan, maybe. He recently requested supplemental funding from Congress, proposing $14 billion for Israel and $61 billion for Ukraine. Hold my tongue. However, political disagreements might delay the approval of these funds. Positive developments for Ukraine. Ukraine recently utilized U.S.-provided long-range missiles to target Russian airfields, showcasing their capability to strike deep into enemy territory. Ukraine successfully repelled a Russian assault in Avdiivka, underscoring Russia's challenges in making tangible achievements. Strategic implications. Although Ukraine's gradual advance allows Russia time to bolster its defense, the recent addition of new Ukrainian troops and their ongoing fight for strategically important positions like the village of Novoprokopivka, enhances Ukraine's ability to disrupt Russian supply chains near the Sea of Azov. Oh, lovely. Opinion section, and I'm going, I've skipped some of the opinion pieces, but I'll read whatever the editorial board writes. I really like what they have to say, even though I don't always agree with them on their neocon outlook. I'm just here to read the news. I do like that they're still capitalists somewhat, really monetarist, but and that's a positive thing, I guess. So I'm going to go ahead and read the summary of this story. The automakers cry for EV mercy. General Motors and the Biden administration's EV policies. Main point, that General Motors, GM, is delaying its electric pickup truck production due to declining EV demand. Boy, has it ever declined. And profitability concerns. Yep. However, a potential change in the Biden administration's EV policy might make EV production less attractive for Detroit automakers. Background: on September 14th, the Energy Department approached Ford, GM, and Stellantis to discuss challenges linked to the proposed rule affecting electric vehicle EV credits under the corporate average fuel economy CAFE standards. Historically, an EV credit system established during Congress's 1979 Chrysler bailout permitted automakers to comply with CAFE standards. The Clinton administration enhanced this by attributing a 6.67 fuel economy multiplier to EVs. This meant that an EV with 40 miles per gallon would be credited for 266.8 miles per gallon under the CAFE standards. This multiplier allowed Detroit automakers to produce profitable gasoline vehicles while complying with escalating fuel economy requirements. The change. In 2021, environmental groups like the Sierra Club and the Natural Resource Defense Council urged the Biden administration to remove the 6.67 EV multiplier, arguing its legal basis was doubtful. Their underlying aim is to compel automakers to produce more EVs by adjusting CAFE standards. The Energy Department has suggested abolishing the 6.67 multiplier. Consequently, vehicles like the Ford F-150 Lightning would drop from a 237.7 mile per gallon credit to a 67.1 mile per gallon credit. Wow. The combined impact of these proposals implies that by 2032, EVs might need to continue or constitute 100% of new vehicles. Impact on Detroit's automakers. Detroit manufacturers would be adversely affected compared to foreign competitors, due to the larger portion of pickups and SUVs in their fleet sales. They highlighted that the suggested rule could decrease the value of their EV investments and revealed that compliance with government mandates is a priority over consumer demands. GM's previous strategy was to manufacture sufficient EV pickups to meet CAFE standards, but with the proposed changes, they might find it more cost-effective to pay government penalties rather than upscale production of less popular EVs. This is likely a factor in GM's decision to reduce EV production. Conclusion. The current system, which combines high fuel economy standards with enhanced EV credits, allows automakers to give an impression of high efficiency, although the administration, the Biden regime, is considering implications of its EV mandate. More realistic and transparent fuel economy rules would be preferable. How about just stay out of it? Anyway, echoes of Beirut 1983 in Israel today. Iran-backed terrorists killed 241 Americans without paying a price. The 40th anniversary of the Beirut barracks bombing and its implications for Israel. Main points. The 40th anniversary of the Beirut barracks bombing, where 307 people died, including 241 Americans, is observed on Monday. This incident is reminiscent in the debate concerning Israel's reaction to the recent attacks on October 7th, where 1,400 people were killed, including 31 Americans. Islamic Jihad, a forerunner to the Hezbollah militia backed by Iran and Lebanon, claimed responsibility for the Beirut attack. Though many U.S. officials suspect Iran's involvement, the Reagan administration neither attributed specific blame nor reacted militarily, choosing to pull out U.S. troops from Beirut instead. The Beirut attack was seen as a strategic win for jihadists in Iran. The non-retaliation is believed to have emboldened Iran, thinking they could harm Americans without repercussions. Iran's proxies, including its shaped IEDs during the Second Iraq War, have since targeted Americans, resulting in numerous casualties. The Biden administration currently states there's no conclusive evidence that Iran was involved in the October 7th attack, although Iran's support for Hamas in terms of arms and finance indicates some responsibility. There are concerns that Iran might face no consequences for the death of Americans, just as in Beirut. The narrative urges that Israel must defend its citizens. If Hamas, with its actions of killing and kidnapping, remains empowered in Gaza, it could signal to Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran that such acts can be repeated without severe consequences. While the U.S. had, and why would they think that we have any teeth? Biden literally doesn't have any teeth. He just wears dentures. While the U.S. had the option to retreat from Beirut in 1983, Israel's survival is more directly at stake, and it may need to consider all possible means, including military ones, to protect its people and eliminate threats. Conclusion: the U.S. learned from the Beirut bombing that a lack of response can be costly. Israel, given its unique position and threats it faces, needs to decide its course of action while weighing its consequences. All right, next story from the editorial board. Why Bidenomics isn't popular. Here's my summary. Majority families have fallen behind. A new Fed report says, yeah, everybody's feeling it, even the rich. Bidenomics and its impact on minority. All right. Main points. A recent poll indicated that swing state voters disapprove of Biden's economic policies, Bidenomics, by a significant margin. The Federal Reserve's latest survey of consumer finances reveals that while the overall net worth of American families increased by 37% between 2019 and 2022 due to equity and housing price surges, the financial wellness doesn't reflect equally across racial lines. Inflation-adjusted incomes for white families grew by a mere 1.3%. Woohoo! For Black and Hispanic families, incomes declined by 1.6% and 1.1% respectively. Although minority households notably benefited from pandemic-related government support such as stimulus checks, rental assistance, and enhanced unemployment benefits, these aids have concluded, and the resulting inflation has adversely impacted consumers, particularly those with static real incomes. The wealth gains for Black and Hispanic families were primarily in housing, a relatively illiquid asset. Their liquid assets, like cash and savings, saw minimal growth for Hispanic families and decrease for Black families. The increasing value of homes doesn't help families with daily expenses, explaining the dissatisfaction with Biden's economic strategies. Economic pessimism has increased across all racial demographics. Black and Hispanic families reported significant surges in economic uncertainty compared to 2019. Despite the low unemployment rate of 3.8%, the financial strains on Americans persist due to bills increasing proportionally or even outpacing their earnings. Conclusion. The negative perspective on Biden's economic policies is grounded in tangible struggles faced by Americans, especially minorities. Despite the challenges posed by Bidenomics, Biden has yet to adjust his approach, which could have political repercussions, as suggested by polls that favored Trump in potential 2024 swing states. Many Americans seem to be nostalgic for the economic environment during Trump's tenure. Very interesting. All right. Let's go to business and finance news. Food makers pitch specials again. Ooh. Food makers pitch specials again. Consumers stunned by high food prices. Yep. Food promotions in grocery stores have returned to levels unseen since 2019, but prices are still about one-third higher than that period, as per Nielsen IQ. Despite promotions, consumers are spending significantly more on food. For example, the average price for promotional pretzels was 47% higher compared to 2019, and on-sale peanut butter and pancake mix were 21% and 33% higher, respectively. Rachel Pelletieri, an Illinois resident, voiced her shock at cereal prices priced at $8.99. What? Wow. And noted she spends around $600 monthly on food for her family of 6. That's it? Okay. I mean, she must be living like a peasant. Many are avoiding new products to prevent waste and relying more on leftovers. Sales volumes of food products have declined, with overall U.S. food sales by unit down 2% from last year. As a result, food companies' stock prices have suffered. The S&P 500 packaged foods and meats sub-index has fallen 19% this year. Wow. To attract consumers, companies and restaurants are offering various deals. For instance, Cracker Barrel introduced an all-day brunch starting at $8.99, KFC promoted 8 wings for $4.99, and Applebee's provided unlimited wings for $12.99. They're skimping on quality, that's for sure. During the pandemic, promotions declined due to supply chain issues. ConAgra reduced promotions on certain items because of supply shortages. Now, as the supply chain stabilizes, the company is reintroducing some promotions. U.S. supermarket prices rose by 2.4% in September year over year, while restaurant prices surged by 6%. Food industry leaders believe consumers will adapt to these increases as wages grow and more promotions become available. We will see. High-tech earnings test the market. A group of technology stocks referred to as the Magnificent Seven. We all know Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta Platforms, Microsoft, Nvidia, and Tesla has significantly propelled the S&P 500's 2023 rally. Their performance has been so pivotal that without these companies, the S&P 500's return this year would be a mere 0.6% as opposed to the 11% it has achieved. This year, interest in artificial intelligence has further attracted investors to these tech giants, along with their perceived stability in the face of economic uncertainty. Their combined contributions to the S&P 500 earnings are projected to increase from 17% in 2022 to 24% in 2025. Upcoming earnings reports from these companies are highly anticipated as they will allow investors to assess the future prospects of these tech giants and the broader market. Any underperformance as seen recently with Tesla could cause significant market reactions given these companies' significant weight in the S&P 500. Moreover, some of these tech companies are dealing with legal and operational challenges which could impact their stock prices. Notably, the valuation of these stocks appears high relative to their earnings, leading some to believe that they might be vulnerable to corrections. Apple reliance on China firm complicates path. So Apple, while trying to lessen its dependency on China, has increasingly relied on a Chinese firm called Luxshare Precision, led by Grace Wang. Luxshare is an integral assembler of Apple's products, including AirPods, Apple Watch, iPhone 15, and the forthcoming mixed reality headset. Apple CEO Tim Cook's recent visit to Luxshare's factory signifies the importance of their partnership despite challenges presented by the Chinese government's recent measures against foreign devices and apps. Grace Wang's rise is notable. Initially, she worked at Foxconn, a dominant force in iPhone assembly, but later branched out to establish her factory. Over time, Luxshare, under Wang's leadership, expanded its capabilities and started fulfilling orders that even Foxconn couldn't imagine. Wang's business acumen and expertise have enabled Luxshare to manufacture intricate Apple products like AirPods efficiently. That's good news. In recent years, Apple has encountered risk with over-reliance on a singular supplier, especially after issues at Foxconn. As a result, Apple has increased its reliance on Luxshare, with the latter company attributing over 73% of its revenue to its largest customer, presumably Apple. This has raised concerns about Luxshare's dependency on Apple, especially considering the traditionally low margins on assembly business. Wang acknowledges the risks of over-reliance and has started diversifying Luxshare's clientele, including investments in suppliers to electric vehicle makers. Meta, in internal debate on Gaza war content. Why? Just let it just. Meta, in internal debate on Gaza war. Meta Platforms, the company behind social media giants like Facebook and Instagram, has faced challenges in regulating content during the recent conflict between Hamas and Israel. After an increase in hateful comments, particularly from the Palestinian territories, Meta escalated the use of its automated filters to curb this content. However, this move drew internal criticism, especially from Muslim employees, as it seemed to inconsistent with Meta's pledge to apply policies uniformly worldwide. The company has historically struggled to enforce content rules for non-English languages, particularly for the Palestinian Arabic dialect and Hebrew. This has led to errors such as Instagram's auto-translation feature wrongly translating certain phrases to Palestinian terrorists, while human moderators sometimes step in. They often have different interpretations of the rules based on their regional perspectives. After the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel, in which numerous civilians were killed, hateful comments surged on Instagram. Meta's response was to hide comments more aggressively, especially those likely to be inflammatory. However, when their regular thresholds didn't stem the tide from the Palestinian territories, they lowered the bar even further for that region, leading to internal objections. The European Union has requested information from Meta regarding its efforts to control the spread of potentially illegal content related to the attacks. Additionally, the company has faced challenges with its specific content, such as that from a Palestinian photographer who gained a significant following by posting graphic content from the conflict. The photographer's account was shut down twice. Why? But was reinstated upon appeal. There we go. The photographer's account was shut down twice, but was reinstated upon appeal. Meta acknowledges the need for improvements in its content filtering systems, especially in languages other than English, and is working on refining its algorithms for better accuracy and fairness. Nike is trying to catch up after falling behind in innovation race. Nike footwear sales in North America changed from a year earlier. It's stagnant, flat, spiked a little bit during the shoe craze during the pandemic. So Nike experienced a recent success when marathon runner Kelvin Kiptum set a world record wearing their new Alphafly 3 shoe. However, the brand faces growing competition in the broader market. Brands like Hoka, On, Adidas, and New Balance are gaining popularity among runners and individuals seeking comfortable daily wear. Despite increasing their shoe prices, Nike reported a 2% decrease in North American footwear sales in the last quarter due to a 10% drop in sales volume. This decline marks the first in over a year. Factors such as rising prices have led consumers to reconsider their spending habits. Nevertheless, Nike remains the leading global seller of athletic footwear and apparel, boasting $48.7 billion in revenue for the year ending May 31st. The company is actively seeking ways to connect more deeply with everyday runners and enhance its product marketing and selection. Hoka's sales reached $1.4 billion for the year ending March 31st, a substantial increase from $223 million in 2019. On Holding, which owns the On brand, reported a 69% year-on-year growth, with sales reaching approximately $1.3 billion by the end of 2022. Industry insiders have observed a perceived slowing in Nike's pace of innovation, particularly concerning their Vaporfly and Alphafly lines. While these shoes were revolutionary when released and catered to serious runners willing to invest more than $200, they don't necessarily meet the needs of those seeking everyday comfort. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Nike focused on introducing new color and design variations of popular lines, which received mixed reactions from consumers. Production challenges stemming from the pandemic and resulting supply chain disruptions have impacted Nike's operations, leading to inventory imbalances. However, the company is working to rectify these issues and plans to reconnect with some retail partners it had previously distanced from. Despite these challenges, investor confidence in Nike remains robust, with shares rising 16% over the past year. Let's go to the next story. Shipping container lessor is bought. We're still under business and finance. Infrastructure investor Stone Peak has agreed to acquire the shipping container leasing company Textainer for over $2 billion. Textainer's shareholders will receive $50 per share, bringing the company's valuation to approximately $2.1 billion, including Textainer's debt. The entire transaction is valued at around $7.4 billion. Textainer's stock was priced at $34.15. Nice. As of the last trading session, Bermuda-headquartered Textainer deals with the purchase, management, and leasing of marine cargo containers and has been a long-term provider for the U.S. military. Established in 1979 and going public in 2007, the company disclosed a net income of $51.3 million for Q2, a decline from $78.5 million from the previous year as the shipping sector adjusts post the COVID-19 pandemic peak demand. Infrastructure investment funds such as Stone Peak, based in New York with over $57 billion in assets, are perceived as reliable during economic instability due to the steady income streams of their assets. Stone Peak primarily invests in communications, digital infrastructure, energy, transportation, and logistics sectors. Let's go to business news. Taylor Swift, Scorsese films top box office. Are you a Swiftie? Taylor Swift's concert film, Taylor Swift: The Eras Tour, set a record at the domestic box office, becoming the first concert movie to surpass $100 million in gross earnings. Wow. Over the weekend, it earned $31 million, bringing its domestic total to $129.8 million. That's great. This performance outpaced Martin Scorsese's Killers of the Flower Moon, which grossed $23 million domestically and $44 million worldwide. Despite October typically being a subdued month for theaters, the success of these films has revitalized the box office. Scorsese's movies, released by Apple Original Films in theaters before its debut on Apple TV Plus, features stars like Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro recounting the story of the Osage murders in the 1920s. The unexpected success of Swift's concert film highlights the potential for alternative content in theaters, according to senior media analyst Paul Dergarbedian. Actors and studios to restart talks. The Hollywood Actors Union and leading studios and streamers plan to resume negotiations to end a prolonged strike that has disrupted TV and film production. The Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers had previously ceased talks due to the union's revised demand for a share in streaming revenue. The Screen Actors Guild, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists, SAG-AFTRA, has faced pressure from notable members including George Clooney and Emma Stone to finalize a deal and restart industry operations. High-ranking executives from entertainment powerhouses such as Disney's Bob Iger and Netflix's Ted Sarandos, Netflix, he's the co-CEO, right, are expected to be involved in the discussions. Despite generous offers from major stars to address the union's financial challenges, SAG President Fran Drescher highlighted that these gestures wouldn't address the underlying issue or meet regulatory standards. The ongoing strikes have caused significant disruptions and economic damage, especially in regions dependent on the entertainment sector. Okay, now, Guild faulted for lack of statement on Gaza. Oh my, what shall we do? The entertainment industry is actively discussing the rise of anti-Semitism and recent events between Hamas and Israel. Walt Disney CEO Bob Iger, along with other prominent figures like Barry Weiss, Sam Levinson, David Mamet, and Chris Pine, attended a meeting on anti-Semitism at the residence of hedge fund CEO Daniel Loeb. This was organized due to growing concerns about anti-Semitism in the U.S. even before the October 7th attack on Israel. There has been division among Hollywood writers, especially after the Writers Guild of America, WGA, did not issue statements condemning the attacks, even though they had spoken on other political and social matters in the past. Over 75 writers discussed potential actions, including withholding dues from WGA, during a Zoom meeting. In an open letter on Medium, celebrities like Jerry Seinfeld and Sacha Baron Cohen Borat expressed their disappointment in the Guild's silence. The president of the Writers Guild of America West, Meredith Dime expressed shared concern in an email but highlighted the complexity of the situation. The WGA has not officially commented. No comment from me. Technology. Beijing probes key Apple supplier. Foxconn Technology Group, a major supplier to Apple, is cooperating with Chinese authorities following reports in Chinese state media that the company is under investigation for tax and land use across China. The state-backed Global Times stated that Foxconn's facilities in the Guangdong and Jiangsu provinces are being examined for tax issues, and land use in Henan and Hubei provinces is also under scrutiny. Foxconn responded by confirming its commitment to legal compliance and promised active cooperation with the relevant investigations. The founder of Foxconn, Terry Gou, who is currently running as an independent candidate for the Taiwanese presidency, has faced criticism over his business ties in China. Critics argue that these connections make him vulnerable to Beijing's influence. Foxconn and Gou have tried to distance themselves from each other, especially after Gou's presidential bid announcement. Gou's candidacy has implications for Taiwan's relationship with Beijing. He positions himself as a unifying figure against the pro-independence Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan. Three, tied to WPP's China unit. I don't even know what WPP stands for. Shanghai police have detained one current and two former employees of Group M, a subsidiary of the London-based advertising conglomerate WPP, on suspicions of accepting bribes. The authorities referred to three individuals from an unnamed advertising firm in a statement about the alleged bribery, which a source identified as Group M. The police claim that the bribery incidents occurred between 2019 and February 2023. This situation arises amidst growing concerns among foreign companies in China about police actions and new regulations, notably the updated anti-espionage law introduced in July. However, the Group M case is described as commercial bribery, not espionage. Group M, China, has not provided any comments on the matter. Markets Digest. I'm going to go over this down the road. I have a, I look at different things. Typically, I'll look at the Dow Jones Industrial. I look at transports using, so transports, the NASDAQ, S&P 500, I look at some inflation stuff, I look at the yield curve typically, the 30-year mortgage rate, currencies, I look at all this stuff and we'll go over it. I'll come up with a system of going over it daily. I look at dividend rises, dividend decreases, dividend payouts, stuff like that. Commodities. I do like their markets section here. But anyway, I digress. Markets. Private equity stays bullish on pay. Despite a challenging year for private equity, employees in the industry anticipate that their pay will at least match the previous year's, if not exceed it. A survey conducted by Odyssey Search Partners revealed that private equity professionals anticipate their cash compensation to be 13% higher than the previous year. Almost half of those surveyed have either guaranteed bonuses or have been informed of their expected payout. Unlike investment banking or hedge funds, where compensation fluctuates significantly based on performance, private equity bonuses and salaries derive from stable and predictable management fees. This stability and income means that private equity professionals can expect consistent compensation even during tough economic periods. However, there are concerns about the future prospects of profits from carried interest due to a decline in mergers and acquisitions. The most substantial income for top private equity personnel comes from carried interest, which surpasses their salary and bonus. The future stability of these income levels hinges on the ability of these firms to sell their assets profitably. In terms of cash compensation, junior employees in private equity are predicted to see the most significant gains, while senior management's pay is expected to remain flat. Goldman veteran to head asset manager. This article right here. Luke Sarsfield, a veteran of Goldman Sachs, is set to become the chief executive of Dallas-based asset manager P10, which specializes in alternative investments. P10, with a market value of $1.1 billion, manages $22 billion for investors, providing access to private equity, venture capital, and other assets through brands like Bonaccord, Capital Partners, and TrueBridge. The firm has plans for further expansion, including potential deals to venture into new areas of investment services. Robert Alpert and Clark Webb, the co-founders and current co-CEOs of P10, will remain on the board, with Webb assisting Sarsfield in potential deals. Sarsfield's 23-year tenure at Goldman Sachs includes significant leadership roles. However, he departed from Goldman following a restructuring that effectively lowered his position. This move comes after a series of executives' departures from Goldman Sachs in recent times. Heard on the street. Housing affordability remains an economic burden. The upcoming report from the Commerce Department is expected to show a positive influence of housing on the economic growth in the third quarter. However, this shouldn't overshadow concerns that the current state of the housing market might be detrimental to the broader economy. Sales of previously owned homes in September were notably lower than they have been since the early days of the pandemic. This decrease can be primarily attributed to the sharp rise in mortgage rates. Such an increase has made many homeowners reluctant to sell, as they fear having to contend with higher rates when purchasing their next home. Although existing home sales don't weigh heavily on the GDP, the shortage in their inventory has prompted some consumers to opt for new homes. This shift seems to be boosting the residential investment component of GDP. On the surface, one might infer that the housing sector is showing resilience against interest rate hikes. However, the underlying reality points toward the adverse effects of high rates, limited inventory, and dwindling affordability on the economy. This current market situation also has a ripple effect. Homeowners' reluctance to relocate might lead them to pass on better job opportunities elsewhere, which in turn can hamper economic growth. According to the challenges, housing affordability has reached its most dismal point since 1985. Wow. While a reduction in rates could provide some relief, the continuously soaring home prices continue to pose a significant challenge. For a healthier housing market equilibrium to be established, American incomes must grow at a rate faster than housing values. Yep, that's not happening, or I think it currently is, perhaps. This adjustment might take years to materialize, and until then, the housing sector will remain a significant concern for the U.S. economy. Interesting. Inventory of existing homes for sale in the month. So we have existing inventories declining. Who wants to sell? Cumulative change in the S&P 500 case-shiller and U.S. National Home Price Index and consumer prices since January 1995. Wow. But new homes are on the rise because if you look at builder permits, that's the only way that they can sell anything is if they put new homes on the market. And that's why builders have been doing really well for months and months on end. For American Express, rewards get a little less costly. Since the pandemic, the expense of credit card rewards has increased as card companies sought to motivate continued card usage. This posed potential issues for issuers because borrowing decreased. However, for American Express, Amex, This trend is showing signs of improvement in the third quarter. Amex's variable customer engagement expenses, which cover rewards and perks, made up around 40% of their revenue, down from 41% the previous year. Although a 1% difference seems small, it equates to a significant amount annual profit. Amex is managing to negotiate better terms with new points redemption partners, effectively reducing costs despite recent controversy surrounding changes to Amex partner Delta Airlines frequent flyer program. Amex reported almost a 20% growth in Delta card spending year over year, while Amex shares fell by about 5% due to broader economic concerns. The evolving dynamic of rewards costs remains a key trend to monitor for both card companies and merchants. Successful companies like Amex and buy now pay later providers could have leverage in a tough economy if they can direct and sustain increased spending toward partner merchants. Let's go to some commodities. Orange juice. Crazy. Orange is collected in Arcadia, Florida. Orchards in Florida were hurt by citrus tree disease and extreme weather. So, lower supply. Global frozen concentrate orange juice stocks. Insane. Production of oranges in Florida. Change in Florida concentrate orange juice futures prices over the past 2 years. Most actively traded contracts. It's a nice little 210% appreciation there. So due to the combined impact of a spreading greening disease and extreme weather conditions, orange juice prices have risen significantly. Al Underwood, a 69-year-old from Ridgeland, Mississippi, noted his reduced consumption of orange juice due to the price increase. The cost of frozen concentrate orange juice futures has more than tripled since late 2021. As of early October, a gallon of orange juice in grocery stores averaged $9.18, which is over a 10% increase from the previous year. Analysts believe the heightened price could further reduce orange juice demand as consumers turn to other beverages. Florida's orange output is anticipated to rise compared to 2022, but it's still down by over 50% from 2 years prior. Brazil, the top global orange producer, has also been affected by the greening disease, limiting its ability to address the supply shortage. In Florida, farmers struggle with the disease and the aftermath of Hurricane Ian, with no immediate relief in sight. As a result, many farmers have switched to other crops or livestock. Cost of labor has also risen, pushing the break-even price for oranges even higher. Nevertheless, speculative investors believe prices will continue to ascend, while some traders believe prices are nearing their maximum. There's optimism as Florida sees new orange grove plantings. And that's it for today. Thank you for listening. I'm going to do this every day, and probably I'm going to just focus on the business section, maybe the front page, and maybe any economic news in the U.S. section, and maybe go into more in-depth analysis. We'll go over the market section a little more. I'll cover that daily, and we'll try to post before, at least an hour before the market opens. So thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. Please comment. Please subscribe. Put on your notifications, and let me know what you like and didn't like. I know this is kind of dry, but the point is to summarize each, important article to just to get through the journal quickly, and I'm doing it all for you. We're summarizing it for you, and then I'm reading the summary of it for you. And I'll scroll through the page, and I thank the Wall Street Journal. This might be against YouTube's policy, but I am summarizing it. This is Creative Commons. I'm using this for educational purposes, and I'm encouraging people to go and subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, and giving the writers of these, like Justin Lahart, I enjoy his writing. Go and check him out. Subscribe and follow Justin Lahart. I think Wall Street Journal's doing a deal right now where they charge like $1 a week, something insane. But I get the print edition usually. And anyway, that's all for today. Thank you for your time. Have a great day.